I thought Cortez says that he was recording.
Oh yeah, Cortez, can you record?
No.
Alright, sweet.
Start.
Hi. All right. So, do you want me to like reintroduce myself for the video?
Go ahead.
All right. I am Ia or Tayin. Tayin, whichever way you want to say it, really. What matters is that you get Ia right. Anyhow, so I'm a post-leftist, post-Marxist, post-civilization theorist and insurrectional. And if you don't know what that means, you'll find out eventually as you talk to me. I just kind of want to, before I get started, I kind of want to get from people who were here for the other two lectures, kind of like what kind of explanation Annie has been going off of, you know, just kind of to freshen me up, and then I'll move on from there to try and, you know, make this the smooth transition so that our the way we're explaining it is in line and everything. So if anyone has anything on that they could share. State. Who, what? Very, very cohesive. Blah. Okay. So, all right. So I guess I'll just start with my notes now. These this may seem a little disorganized at times, but overall it kind of has a anyhow. All right. So in chapter 5, it's the economic basis of the withering away of the state. And in this one, he's really talking about like the the economic basis, like the actual base, what we would consider the base, the modes of production, means of production, factors of production, etc. Until the end of the lecture. So in the first section, we have the presentation of the question by Marx. And oh crap, I am very unprepared for this. So there's no question of specifying the moment of the future of withering away. So if I can open up, let me open this up so I can be better. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to present on anything today.
Sorry, our main lecturer is just kind of we don't know what happened to her right now, so we're just having to rely on Ia right now. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I have notes, but they're not really notes for presentation, so it's just for me to understand. So
just give him a few minutes.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you. It's loading up. All right. All right. So we're going to Abolition of Parliamentarianism, Organization of National Unity, Chapter 4. Okay. I'm sorry, I wasn't as prepared. Okay, so presentation of the question by Marx. So yeah, this is basically kind of this section is basically kind of Lenin going over the critique of the Gotha program, and this is, I mean, like this kind of was inspired by it, and this kind of like this piece kind of reintroduced that into common vernacular and common understanding. So presentation of the question. Writers on the question of the state was very considerable. I'm trying to figure out what I was writing about. On the basis of what facts then can the question of the future development of communism be dealt with? So it's not so much about the moment of when this happens. It's about the actual conditions of it, because the conditions are always present in certain societies. So like it's just an application of what the next moment will be because of our current conditions, which goes into the next note that I have here, is that Lenin kind of states that this theory of Marx is the application of theory of development to modern capitalism. So this kind of goes into like what we would consider historical materialism, and some people dialectical materialism, about what comes next and what can we see as like it is germinating within this this format. And so within this format, and this is a lot of what Kropotkin bases his work off of, is seeing these germs of future society and present society. If you read Fields, I think it's Fields, Factories, and Workshops, and some of them say of tomorrow or of the future. That's kind of what Kropotkin was trying to do with that. And so even though he wasn't like a Marxist historical materialist, he kind of fell onto it in a way, and I feel like that's that's what he was kind of pointing to in that. So in this though, Marx also kind of faced the problem of applying this theory to collapse of capital and the development of communism. And so he looked to history and he saw that communism would be the result of a social force that capital gave birth to. And that social force is the proletariat, the oppressed class, the class that produces but does not own. And that's his analysis of uh, these countries. And he goes into talking about civilized countries and whatnot. And then the next section talks about how this moment, this kind of flipping of the dialectic, the flipping of the two sides, is inevitably a transitional phase because things don't happen immediately. There is a definite moment of transition, which is the next section, the transition from capitalism to communism. Now, a lot of MLs, this is where they start getting stuff wrong, because from capitalism to communism, let's just read what Marx says right here. Between capitalist and communist society lies the period of revolutionary transformation of one to the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transitional period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. So a lot of debate goes over this term, uh, Staatswesen, Gemeinwesen, things like that. In the German ideology, Marx used Gemeinwesen, which translates more to community than it does to state. Here, Staatswesen can refer to like a grouping of a city, or some people try to interpret it as like an actual state. But this is kind of in Malatesta's view, he actually wrote a letter to someone about the dictatorship of the proletariat and communism, and he said, well, the dictatorship of the proletariat is the proletariat essentially taking over and proletarianizing everyone to where everyone is essentially a member of the state, and it's like the state that is no longer a state, similar to how the proletariat is a class that is defined by no longer by being a class that doesn't have a class character. It's If that doesn't make sense, that's fine, but it's basically it's something that is a state because it's class power being exerted, but it's not a state as in like it's a bureaucratic government in a way. And Malatesta, he kind of likened this to anarchy because it's people deciding freely, like free association, um, but with the goal in mind of eliminating class society. And so this is kind of why I dislike classical anarchism, is because they think they found the answer when they subject society to things like federalism or federationism, when they're just describing the dictatorship of the proletariat and they're saying, oh, this is communism. And this is kind of, and Lenin kind of had gone into it before, earlier in this book. But actually getting to the point, to achieve its emancipation, The proletariat must overthrow the bourgeoisie, win political power, and establish its revolutionary dictatorship. And this is just kind of like the starting moment. So when you think of like those moments that you think of as revolution, those insurrections, insurgencies, etc., where the proletariat finally takes power, that's not the end of it. That's step one. And a lot of people, and Lenin was kind of warning people about this. A lot of people think this is the only step and that everything will just kind of fall into place like dominoes. That was kind of the fault of that's kind of the fault of most of revolutions that have succeeded the Russian one, and even in the Russian Revolution, there were some aspects. Specifically, I think the ICT says like after 1928. I would argue after 1921, but that's my personal opinion. Um, but this begins this transition phase, and this transition phase is actually what is the revolution. This is because if you know like revolution as a like strictly as a word, it really means to turn something over. So RPM in your car is revolutions per minute of your wheels, right? The thing that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and it has thousands implied with each of those. Each one of those is a revolution. So in that moment, it's only halfway turned, if you can think of it that way. And the rest of the turn is kind of like a struggle to turn it all the way around, like all 360 degrees, to where you've achieved, a new format. Because it's like a wheel turning, but it's also like going into something new. And I'm ending up trying to describe dialectics here. Um, but so freedom, he goes into the idea of freedom in society and whatnot. And Lenin declares that freedom in capitalist society remains about the same as the ancient Greek representatives. It's the freedom for the slave owners, freedom for those who own. And so capitalist society has restriction after restriction against democracy, which can go into contradictions that people noted about capitalism. Is that liberal ideologians kind of came up with democracy as like, oh, everyone is equal despite your class position. But eventually it has, because the bourgeoisie makes up a smaller and smaller portion, it has to go against democracy in order to, or it has to go against democracy either in framing or in law in order to protect its interests. And so the forward development is postulated to be a procession through greater and greater, not a procession of greater and greater democracy. All right, let me go back to the book for a second. What then is the relationship of this dictatorship to democracy? We have seen that the Communist Manifesto simply places side by side the two concepts to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class. To win the battle of democracy. On the basis of all that has been said above, it is possible to determine more precisely how democracy changes in the transition of capitalism to communism. This democracy is always hemmed in the narrow limits set by capitalist exploitation, and consequently always remains, in effect, a democracy for the minority, only for the property classes, only for the rich. And there he goes into that statement. Democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich, that is the democracy of capitalist society. If we look more closely into the machinery of capitalist democracy, we see everywhere in the petty, supposedly petty, details of the suffrage, residential qualifications, exclusion of women, etc., the technique of the representative institutions in the actual obstacles of the right to assembly. Public buildings are not for paupers. In purely capitalist organization of the daily press, we see restriction after restriction upon democracy. These restrictions, exceptions, exclusions, obstacles for the poor seem slight, especially in the eye of one who has never known want himself. Blah 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 blah. Marx grasped this essence of capitalist democracy splendidly well in analyzing the experience of the commune. He said that the oppressed are allowed once every few years to decide which particular representatives of the oppressing class shall represent and repress them in parliament. I think that was a joke that Lenin, like it was supposed to be like kind of like a joke that Lenin was making there. Not that Marx was wrong, but just that we should find that funny. Um, Capitalist democracy, dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e., the organization of the vanguard of the oppressed as the ruling class for the purpose of suppressing the oppressors, cannot result merely in an expansion of democracy. Okay, so this is the section that he was talking about. Simultaneously, with an immense expansion of democracy, which for the first time becomes democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, and not democracy for the moneybags. The dictatorship of the proletariat imposes a series of restrictions on the freedom of the oppressors, the exploiters, the capitalists. We must suppress them in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Their resistance must be crushed by force. It is clear that there is no freedom and no democracy where there is suppression and where there is violence. So this is what my note was talking about: is that it's not just greater and greater democracy. There has to be um, some exploitation of the exploiters, and this kind of goes into expropriation and different tactics of removing the power of the capitalists. And versus capitalist resistance. The organization of the vanguard as the ruling class to suppress the former oppressors does not equal the expansion of democracy. That's just kind of restating the idea of that the vanguard, and Lenin has a very interesting view of the vanguard. He also believed in professional revolutionaries, which is it's something that I personally disagree with. And his conception of the vanguard was like, democratic centralist, and I have issues with Lenin's vanguard, but it's the idea that the vanguard is that in the state, and that it's kind of in What Is to Be Done. He says that the vanguard should not be the rear guard. It should not be dragging along the coattails of the proletariat as they move forward, but that it should be what leads the proletariat. Now, I kind of disagree with that, because being the end guard or the rear guard, in my opinion, what that means to me is that we're behind the proletariat, pushing them to do their own will, rather than the vanguard saying, here's your historical mission and here's what you're going to do about it. Now, some people may qualify my Lenin shit posting before it was cool. Some people will qualify that maybe that's not what Lenin actually meant, but in his writing, that's what comes out, and that's part of what has led to bad interpretations of Lenin. Bad interpretations, whether they're whether Stalin or whomever, And I'm not saying, oh, it's Lenin's fault for Stalin. No, it's Stalin's fault for Stalin, but Lenin, his writing has not helped, and didn't always help. There were some cases in which he was very based, such as when he said socialism is classless, etc. And I think he says similar things here. But it may be that this was the section where he had issues with declaring that. So there's simultaneously universal suffrage and a dictatorship of the proletariat over former oppressors, which is professional language. Like, check this chat. You have to keep in mind that this doesn't originate Lenin. Kautsky was very vanguardist. Yeah, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it did. which okay, I'm not listening to Sinistra after that. So the DOTP expands universal suffrage, women's rights, and in our case, trans, non-binary rights and protections for people of color, etc. While simultaneously suppressing other ignore comments for the sake. Yeah, so I feel like I made my point. Does anybody need me to keep expanding on that? Because I just keep falling back on it because it's the first thing my eyes go to. Does anyone need me to continue with that line of thinking, or am I beating a dead horse? You're good, you can move on? Okay. So, truly free democracy, he goes on to explain, is the withering away of democracy. Because as democracy is expanded, more and more people own their own choices and own their own and they will own their own basically they will own their own material surroundings, political surroundings, material surroundings, however you wish to say it. And so then he goes on to say that a truly free state is the withering away of the state, and the truly free economy is the withering away of economy. This is kind of the conception of being against political economy, which a lot of Marxist Leninists and Maoists kind of seem to forget, as specifically Mao with his creation of the idea of the political economy of socialism, and also Stalin's coping mechanism, economic problems of socialism in the USSR, is that socialism is not a new political economy, but rather the withering away of it or the dismantling of political economy. Because economy is like to whom, for whom. And if there is, it's the question of analyzing to whom, for whom. But if it's from one to one or from each to all, then that's kind of an irrelevant question. And that's kind of what he's talking about here. And if everyone has, if everyone is truly democratic and truly equal, then there is really not too much decision making to be done, because what is there to decide except for what's for dinner? In my opinion, under socialism and under communism, as it were, and then a truly free state, of course, does not have a state. So I'm going to read from. I'm going to read from this. I'm going to read from this section so you get a better idea, because I may not have described it perfectly. I will be skipping a few pieces here, but only in only in communist society, when the resistance of capitalists have disappeared, when there are no classes, i.e., there is no distinction between the members of society as regards to their relation of the social means of production, only when the state ceases to exist and it becomes possible to speak of freedom, only then will a truly complete democracy become possible and realized, a democracy without exception whatever. And only then will democracy begin to wither away, owing to the simple fact that, freed from capitalist society, from the untold horrors, savagery, absurdities, and infamies of capitalist exploitation, people will gradually become accustomed to observing the elementary rules of social intercourse that have been known for centuries and repeated for thousands of years in all copybook maxims. They will become accustomed to observing them without force, without coercion, without subordination, without the special apparatus for coercion called the state. And so he's kind of advocating for like an organic understanding of society, an organic economy, if you will. And I've kind of had ideas about that as well, but he kind of explicitly states that this is what communism will be in here. The expression "the state withers away" is very well chosen, for it indicates both the gradual and spontaneous nature of the process. Only habit can, and undoubtedly will, have such an effect. For we around us on millions of occasions, for we see around us on millions of occasions how readily people become accustomed to observing the necessary rules for social intercourse when there is no exploitation, when there is nothing that arouses indignation, evokes protest and revolt, and creates the need for suppression. And this is kind of like, this is where we see intersections between anarchist and Marxist thought. Excuse me while I have some water. And we see the intersection specifically of Marxist and individualist anarchist thought. Some social anarchists will probably agree with this, but the idea of practicing anarchy and being being anarchists in our everyday lives is kind of that idea that if we kind of propagate this idea that no one is above anyone else, this classless idea in our everyday lives, then we can kind of get this on the ball rolling. Now it goes into that will lead you into things like the revolution of everyday life by Henri Lefebvre, and so forth. Just kind of ideas of like what Bookchin will call lifestyle anarchists, and so on and so forth. And so on and so forth. So continuing, and so in capitalist society, we have a democracy that is curtailed, wretched, false, a democracy only for the rich, only for the minority. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the period of transition to communism, will for the first time create democracy for the people, for the majority, along with the necessary suppression of the exploiters, the minority. Communism alone is capable of providing a really complete democracy, and the more complete it is, the sooner it will become unnecessary and wither away of its own accord. And this kind of goes into the statements that I've made about democracy, is that like democratic socialism is superfluous, and this is what a lot of people seem to forget, both MLs and Radlibs. Well, they can't forget because they didn't read this section. I mean, MLs probably did, but even still, the further revisions on what socialism is after this book, it kind of the further revisions of socialism being something separate from communism and not one moment in communism is kind of what has clouded this idea. And so like socialism is the moment where, if we were to paint a picture, socialism is the moment where democracy becomes completely free. Socialism is the moment where the state no longer represents an actual state, and where the economy no longer resembles something that is revolving around circulation, right? And the moment we can sort of analyze that, this is when people will start to realize, there will still be concepts like circulation in our mind, which is what Marx talks about in the Critique of the Gotha program with sort of a capitalist superstructure. And this is also what Lenin talks about here with a capitalist superstructure. But I don't know that Lenin fully grasped it, because he still, the imagery of his language isn't the same as Marx's imagery. And so rereading it, I would have to reread it to give a better picture of what Lenin's writing makes in terms of imagery. But basically, it's like this idea, like in our minds, we remember what capitalism was like, or what it was like before socialism, despite socialism appearing different. And then eventually, as we get more accustomed to really free economy, really free state, really free democracy, eventually it's just kind of stops happening. It's like doing something every morning And then you're just like, why am I? Okay, so it's like, okay, let's say you're bald and you're putting on a hat every morning as you go out, right? This is also assuming you go out. Let's say you put on a hat as you go out, and eventually your hair starts growing back. You know, the free society, the free stuff starts coming back, and as it develops into something more free, the less and less you need the hat. And so, let's say you wake up one day and you've got 6 inches of hair on top of your head, and you're like, I don't really need the hat anymore. Why am I putting it on? So you either stop putting it on or you throw it out. That's kind of the idea behind that. I don't know if that was the best imagery for explaining this, but I just kind of figured I would kind of provide some imagery. In other words, under capitalism, we have the state in the proper sense of the word. That is a special machine for the suppression of one class by another, and what is more, of the majority by the minority. Now, this is kind of Bakunin's definition, is a minority expressing power over a majority. Naturally, to be successful, such an undertaking as a systematic expression of the exploited majority by the exploiting minority calls for the utmost ferocity and savagery in the matter of suppressing. It calls for seas of blood through which mankind is actually wading its way in slavery, serfdom, and wage labor. Furthermore, during the transition from capitalism to communism, suppression is still necessary, but it is now the suppression of the exploiting minority. This is what makes it different from our conception of the state. A special apparatus, a special machine for suppression. The state is still necessary, but this is now a transitional state. It is no longer a state in the proper sense of the word. For the suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of wage slaves of yesterday is comparatively so easy, simple, and naturally tasked that it will entail far less bloodshed than the suppression of the rising of slaves, serfs, or wage laborers, and it will cost mankind far less. And it is compatible with the extension of democracy to such an overwhelming majority of the population that the need for a special machine of suppression will begin to disappear as expropriation expands, as all of humanity becomes proletarianized, not in the fact that they're all working in factories, but that they're all aware of their unity as a singular class. They are producers that do not own. Um, this, you know, this need to suppress those, like, eventually people will stop fighting that ideology or that idea that we can all produce and not own. And it's kind of, instead of the Lassallean idea of no, let's actually own what we produce, it's the idea like we don't have to own what we produce because we produce for the benefit of others, benefit of society, etc. And so as this kind of mindset, this idea takes on, um, the less the state will be needed. And it's not the idea that the state is drilling this into people's heads, it's that the material reality is reflecting it. And that's kind of what the superstructural transition is. It's like the material conditions have all been set. Everyone is a proletarian now. Everyone is a worker, as Marx says in Critique of the Goth program. But some people still have these inklings of, I want to accumulate, I want to gain power. But they're unable to because their material reality doesn't let them. And as they kind of grow to acceptance, they're like, wait, why do I want power? I have everything I need. I can do whatever I want. Why do I want to exert myself over others? And this is kind of the mindset that begins to appear under socialism, where the superstructure begins to reflect the base, the economic reality. Lastly, skipping a paragraph here. Lastly, only communism makes the state absolutely necessary, for there is nobody to be suppressed. Nobody in the sense of a class, of a systematic struggle against a definite section of the population. We are not utopians and do not in the least deny the possibility inevitably of excesses on the part of individual persons or the need to stop such excesses. In the first place, however, no special machine, special apparatus of suppression is needed for this. This will be done by the armed people themselves, as simply and as readily as any crowd of civilized people, even in modern society, interferes to put a stop to a scuffle or prevent a woman from being assaulted. And secondly, we know that the fundamental cause of excesses, which consist in the violation of the rules of social intercourse, is the exploitation of the people of their want and their poverty. With the removal of this chief cause, excesses will inevitably begin to wither away. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about. And then, without building utopias, Marx defined more fully what can be defined now regarding this future, namely the differences between the higher and lower phases, levels, or stages of communist society. All right, so moving on to section 3. Before I move on, does anybody have any questions that they want me to clarify? Imagery is based.
Questions in text.
Any questions?
If you have questions, type it in text.
No one is typing, so I'm assuming I'm good. Am I good? Can anyone say yes? You're good. Me drinking water ASMR. So from the first, from the whole social labor, from the whole society, labor of society must be in a reserve fund to expand production, fund the replacement of degradation of machines, administration, schools and hospitals, etc. This is kind of like a cachet of this is kind of a cachet of all the materials that will be needed to do so, rather than a reserve fund of actual money, because money doesn't really exist. It's kind of a tax of the specific materials. Is this, hold on, Sinistra, is this what Lenin was talking about in Tax of Kind? Is Sinistra here? Sinistra, is this what Lenin was talking about tax in kind? Oh, wait, server muted. Because this sounds like what Lenin would have been talking about. I haven't read it yet. Tax in kind. Yeah, is no? Okay. Because this kind of, I don't know, that the term tax in kind of reminds me of this. But this is basically something that Marx brought up to kind of disprove LaSalle, like, hey, society's going to need to have some of this shit in order to repair it, because not everyone's going to know or have everything to repair everything, produce everything, blah blah blah. Some things need to be socially directed, and that makes sense. The idea, some of these things, if we go into a deeper analysis of how they function, schools, hospitals, etc., specifically from a post-civilized mindset, some of these things won't exist, or they won't exist as we understand them. So, like schools, we can go to Bakunin's idea of equal opportunity in education, in which there's no longer like teacher-student relations. It's like there's someone who leads the discussion, and it's really just a group of people coming together who want to learn more. And that's more of like what the university will be. But in terms of like actual schooling, it'll be a lot less like it won't look like schools of today. Not even like the schools in the Nordic countries or the Germanic countries. It won't even look like the more progressive schools we see today. Well, it might resemble them, but those are just the germs of what we would have in future society. So, certificate received after completing socially necessary work, and from this receives from public store of consumer goods a corresponding quantity of production after deduction from the labor to the public fund. Every worker receives what they've given. So basically, there's a deduction on what they produce in order to kind of stabilize society, feed society, etc. And whatever's left is for them to do with how they please. And there really isn't. I'm just going to move on. Uh, development of the development of communist society is compelled to abolish only injustice of private means of production first. So it, this is basically him saying just like the first step is abolishing private property, getting rid of the private ownership of these things and bringing them into the public foray, making them common property or public property depending on your terminology, but I prefer common property. And it's just kind of removing it from both cliques of workers and from cliques of capitalists. So this means that your worker co-op, we're coming for it. And it's just that this is the first condition of establishing communism, is the expropriation of these objects, of these factors of production, is the first section. Which, I mean, you can see this in other people's works around the time. It was even in Kropotkin's work. Is that expropriation is kind of the first step, you know. And conversion of production to common property of society doesn't remove the defects of distribution and inequality of bourgeois law. It continues as long as production is divided by amount of labor performed. So Marx kind of said like, well, there will still, be some form of accumulation as people are given their dues based on their labor time and things like that. And this kind of goes into the labor theory of value, which Marx did not come up with, but he expanded on it and related it to what that means for communism. So with an equal performance of labor and hence an equal share in social consumption fund, one will in fact receive more than other. One will be richer than another, and so on. To avoid these defects, right instead of being equal would have to be unequal. So yeah, it's just the unequal right of accumulation. But this accumulation isn't a mass accumulation. It's petty accumulation. It's not enough to exert over another, because that's what differentiates the capitalist from the worker, is that they can exert what they accumulate, right? And so the only thing that you can exert your accumulation over in this instance is products or factors of production. It's not, you can't exert it on other people, because no one's going to honor it. It's not enough for them to be like, oh, you have to do this for me. No, they're on equal terrain in terms of that they're both working with like labor as the basis of their exchanges, but these exchanges are not like, this isn't barter. And a lot of people kind of misunderstand labor exchange. Kropotkin with his topic on, when he wrote about labor notes in the Conquête du Pain, Conquest of Bread, he talks about them like, oh, there's still circulation, it's still um, it's still money, and he had some valid criticisms of a Lassallean idea of labor notes and whatnot, but not necessarily the Marxist idea of it. Sorry, talking makes me thirsty. So But yeah, this kind of petty accumulation or distribution defects will continue um, because it's kind of how they regulate. Um, it kind of regulates distribution. It's how it's regulated. It's like people are saying, "Oh, I want this much," and "Oh, I want this much," and it's kind of regulation of distribution based on necessity and ability. So it's like a half and half in terms of determining the distribution is kind of what is being explained here. And yes, there is inequality in what you receive, but that's because people make different amounts of people need and want different amounts. And so um all right, so let's go into what Lenin kind of writes here. Um, However, it persists as far as its other part is concerned. It persists in the capacity of the regulator of distribution of products and the allotment of labor among the members of society. The socialist principle, he who does not work shall not eat, is already realized. Oh, this is workerist ideology. Um, but the other socialist principle, an equal amount of products for an equal amount of labor, is also already realized. But this is not yet communism and does not yet abolish bourgeois law, which gives unequal individuals in return for unequal amounts of labor equal amounts of products. Um, this is a defect, says Marx, but it is not avoidable in the first phase of communism. For if we are not to indulge in utopianism, we must not think that having overthrown capitalism, people will at once learn to work for society without any rules of law. Besides, the abolition of capitalism does not immediately create economic prerequisites for such a change. Uh, this is kind of where I break on from Lenin, but in context of the time, um, this is kind of the general he was putting general ideas together and using them to get people to understand. At the time, there wasn't really a non-workerist ideology yet, where it's like, oh, everybody has to work, things like that. Everybody's kind of compelled to do so. Now, I'm not going to go into anti-work or anti-workerism. I just will say that this is kind of this is a take of the time. Um, this is a take of the time, but he's right about like not immediately um, being able to learn to operate without bourgeois law. Now, there are no other rules than those of bourgeois law. To this extent, there still remains the need for a state which, while safeguarding the common ownership of the means of production, would safeguard equality in labor and distribution of products. Now, the state withers away insofar that there are no longer any capitalists, any classes, and consequently no class can be suppressed. But the state has not yet completely withered away, since the still remaining there still remains the safeguarding of bourgeois law, which sanctifies actual inequality. So a lot of fucking MLs will go to this part to fucking defend having a state and calling it and announcing socialism. It's just plain fucking wrong, because whenever there's like criminal suppression, whenever there's crime law, that should indicate to you that there is an undesirable class rather than there is undesirable activity. Um, because crime law always is relative to the class that you belong to, even in the more progressive states of today. Wasn't it Ricardo's theory originally? I mean, Adam Smith and Ricardo both talked about labor. Yeah, even Smith had labor value. Yeah. Labor theory of value is classical economics. Subjective theory of value is some fucking dumb shit that they use to try and disprove Marx despite fucking praising Adam Smith. Like, seriously, these guys think that just because you write about something, you like it. Fucking, like, it's like Elon Musk talking about, oh, Marx was a capitalist. He literally wrote Capital. Like, shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. Wealth of Nations is a criticism as well as an analysis of capitalist society at the point of turn, you know. So, okay. Moving on, we go to the higher phase of communist society. And here Lenin takes an excerpt from Critique of the Gotha Program, where Marx continues in a higher phase of communist society after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and with it also. Let me start over. In a higher phase of communist society, after enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and with it also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a livelihood but life's prime want, after the productive forces have increased with the all-round development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois law be left behind in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners from each according to its ability, to each according to its needs. Lenin goes on, only now can we fully appreciate the correctness of Engels' remarks, mercilessly ridiculing the absurdity of combining the words freedom and state. So long as the state exists, there is no freedom. When there is freedom, there will be no state. And, you know, here it's this kind of comes from the German ideology. This idea being against the division of labor, being against the antithesis of mental and physical labor, which was completely misunderstood by Stalin in Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. Terrible book, 0 out of 10. It's not that. It's that mental and physical labor are performed in conjunction. It's not that, oh, the people that perform mental labor are friends with the people that perform physical labor, and kind of, you know, the alienation of these people into a hierarchical format, such as that of the factory, such as that of the firm. It's the great equalizer of all these different types of labor, and you can do whatever labor you want, and you're going to want to do labor because it's not going to be alienated from you. Now, of course, I am working on like a theory of post labor, because I personally define labor as an alienable action, not an action that is alienated, but one that is capable of being alienated. And kind of flesh out that idea, there are two works that you can look into, which is one, the German ideology, and then Freddie Perlman's Reproduction of Daily Life. Reproduction of Daily Life is not long. The audiobook is like 45 minutes. It's a really good piece of work, but it was kind of formulated before the anti-work theory came about, and so there's like hints of anti-work in there, but there's also some conflation between labor and wage labor, or coerced labor, which is work. And so that's just a personal tidbit I want to add there. But basically, what it's saying here is that you're going to do what you want because you want to do it. You're going to build a house because you want someone else to like live there, or you want to live in it yourself. And you're going to work for other people because we're social beings and we work in conjunction with other people in order to achieve goals. That's what society is. So, in the higher economic basis for the withering of the state is a high state of development of communism at which the antithesis. Okay, blah, blah, blah. More of that. We are entitled to say with the fullest confidence that the expropriation of capitalists will inevitably result in an enormous development of the productive forces of society. But how rapidly this development will proceed, how soon it will reach the point of breaking away from the division of labor, of doing away with the antithesis between mental and physical labor, of transforming labor into life's prime want, we do not and cannot know. This is kind of saying this set of events does happen like a domino falling, but when those dominoes fall are what we don't know. We don't know how big they are, how much they weigh, and which dominoes create which dominoes create which effect, etc. We are only entitled to speak of the inevitability of this event, supposing that the first action, the expropriation of private property into property in common, takes place, which hasn't been disproven yet, because even in the SFSR, they didn't expropriate everything, which is why it was able for capitalism to come around. There was a point where it was a dictatorship of the proletariat, but it was not. It never took the full route of the full expropriation. Because Lenin didn't want to make the peasants unhappy. That was kind of the basis for not expropriating the landed peasantry right away. And that was why there was some petty private ownership. But petty private ownership is still private ownership. And they didn't attack that ruthlessly. Now, I'm not saying that there was a better way to do things. I mean, okay, there was a better way to do things, but I'm not saying that I think I know what that is, because I'm not there, and I will never be there, and I will never know what should have been done, and no one ever will. We do not and cannot know, you know. So it's saying that we can't predict when, but we know how these things develop, and it's we know the actual processes that will kind of lead this through. Now, there are bits and pieces we're going to be missing because we can only predict so much. And so Lenin emphasizes the protracted nature of this, which I feel is a mistake. Not that he's wrong, not that this process probably will be protracted, but in that it kind of gives the sense like, oh, we don't need to do everything right now because it's going to happen eventually. And we can like wait things out and let things develop in stages. And this kind of develops into the stages theory that we see in Marxism Leninism, which is a vulgar justification of being stagnant, which is not what Lenin is emphasizing here. He's just emphasizing that for these moments to take root, it's going to take a long time, not for the actions that lead, not for the actions or the moments themselves to occur, if that makes sense. So he emphasizes the protracted nature, dependence on the development of higher phase of communism, leaving time for it to open. Yeah, so he's saying like there's going to be there's going to reach a certain point of development, but we're never going to know when that is. So moving on, I think this is a quote. Let me make sure. Okay. So the narrow horizon of bourgeois law, which compels one to calculate with the heartlessness of a Shylock whether one has not worked half an hour more than anyone else, this narrow horizon will be left behind. There will be no need for society in distributing the products to regulate the quantity to be received by each. Each will take freely according to his needs. And this is kind of the path of this is kind of what determines higher phase. You know, socialists demand strictest control by society and state over the means of labor and consumption. This is the product of the time. And it's basically, it's not so much like he says it in an authoritative way here, but he's saying it's more so like, it's more so someone having complete control of a hammer that they're wielding rather than um, the hammer being used to actually beat something, if that makes sense. So the burning questions of our present politics, expropriation of the capitalists to convert all people into workers, and of all people into workers and others into one syndicate, the state, and the subordination of entire work to the genuine democratic state of Soviets. Oh Lord have mercy. This is really just him trying to use imagery that was popular at the time to relate this to syndicalists at the time, and to relate it to his, the idea of the Soviets, the councils, which is, it's the only form that hasn't been disproven yet in terms of being able to push us to communism, but like it just kind of goes into this fetishization of the councils and the fetishization of workers and workerism. And this is kind of like our criticism as anti-workerists. And councils are overrated. I don't disagree with that, but I do think that they will exist, and they will be the primary form of organization, whether they're the mode of movement into communism. Like, I think they're going to exist, and they're the most likely out of current organizations to continue, um, to lead us to that way. But um, I'm also an insurrectional, so I don't think really any organization is going to be the one that leads us there. But if I were to pick one, it would be the councils, because they haven't been disproven in terms of achieving it. Then he goes into Plekhanov's conversion of Kropotkins and anarchists to social chauvinists, especially in the revolution, particularly higher form of democracy. I disagree within the period that within the period of there was a moment in time where they did have, like, in the first moments of the SFSR, they did, but it didn't really continue after the formulation, because it became rigidified and static, and that's kind of what led to the downfall. I'm going to, before I finish up chapter 5, I'm going to grab some more water because my throat is getting dry. I will be right back. If you have any questions so far, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll be right back. Just give me 1 minute. It would be very cool if you could edit that section out so that people who go to watch this won't be stuck sitting for like 2 minutes. Anyhow, so I'm going to try and find this section that I wrote this note about Plekhanov, Plekhanov, and his conversion of Kropotkin, whatnot. Maybe that's under a different part. Okay. And this brings to us the question of the scientific distinction between socialism and communism, which Engels touched on in above quoted argument. Okay, yeah. So basically, it was just like we won't have like this. We're not gonna like be utopian and say, oh, we can achieve this immediately. That there will definitely be a transition. But a lot of people focus too much on this transition, and there's got to be some sort of a balance, and that's kind of like this the vulgar materialist analysis of this leads people to be like, okay, we need to identify the stages and we have to be able to announce when stages have occurred. But here Lenin says we're not going to be utopian so much to be able to say we can announce it, because you can't just announce something happens. There has to be a material basis for it, which is one of the biggest criticisms I have of economic problems of socialism in the USSR by J.V. Stalin. As you can tell, I really hate that work. And this brings us to the question of the scientific distinction between socialism and communism, which Engels touched on in his above quoted argument about the incorrectness of the name social democrat. Politically, the distinction between the first or lower and higher phase of communism will, in time, probably be tremendous. But it would be ridiculous to recognize this distinction now under capitalism, and only individual anarchists, perhaps, could invest it with primary importance. If there are people among the anarchists who have learned nothing from the Plekhanov conversion of the Kropotkins, of Grave, Cornelisine, and other stars of anarchism into social chauvinists or anarcho-trenchists, as Gay, one of the few anarchists who have still preserved a sense of humor and a conscience, has put it. So basically, he's calling out Kropotkin for supporting the Allies, and that's why he calls them social chauvinists. Is because, and that's a majority of what Leninists and Marxist-Leninists who've never read Kropotkin, that's all they know of him, is that he supported the Allies during the First World War. And that was kind of just his dig on him, because he was basically saying they're not real anarchists. Which, he's literally calling them radlibs. Well, not radlibs, but radfash, I guess. I don't know. He's basically the equivalent of calling them a radlib today. But from a Marxist point of view, so he's not actually a dumb fuck saying it. So Marxist theory is an explanation of the economic maturity of communism, thinking of communism as like a child growing up. Right now, and this kind of imagery is what we see in things like Civil War in France, and his analysis of the revolutions of 1848 is that he said, oh, in these revolutions, he said specifically in the revolution of 1893 or 1793, excuse me, in France, that there was the germ of this proletarian consciousness, this proletarian uprising during this revolution, but that it was squandered by the leading class of that revolution, which would have been the middle class, the capitalist class. And so, like, even in every revolution, you can always see a germ of the proletarian idea, the germ of the proletarian class knowing itself. And we see it in every uprising, every insurrection, whether it's a revolution or not, because we saw it there was some of it in the American Revolution, which, yes, it is, it is a revolution. Not a very effective one, but it was a revolution. Revolution from a colonial state into a bourgeois state. And we can even look at it in the George Floyd uprisings of this past summer. There was some level of class consciousness within it, but it wasn't enough for it to move forward. And there was a lot of hesitancy, and myself included, in wanting to kind of direct it towards a class-based analysis and something that was more of had revolutionary potential, because it was black people's moment to lead, and changing that felt like an attack on black people's moment, if that makes sense. But even still, we recognize that there was a proletarian element to those actions and a proletarian element to those insurrections, revolutions, whatever you want to call them, you know. And the maturity of those kind of develops with time and with the collective experience of the proletariat. Things like 1936 in Spain. It was there were parts of Spain that were under a phase of what we could consider the dictatorship of the proletariat. Eventually, they got undermined by the radical unions or the radical syndicates um, that professed to be proletarian, but they mediated their struggle against capital in order to defeat the fascists, who were just another branch of capital. And there's more criticism of that, but I would recommend, if you want to read further on that, great lecture, thank you. If you want to read more on that, I'd suggest When Insurrections Die. But anyhow, going back to the actual book that we're reading. So this is kind of where Lenin makes an oopsie. And he says bourgeois law presupposes bourgeois state in lower phase communism. And I'm not going to say any more on that. You can see for yourself. I don't know if that was a joke or whatever it was, but it was just it was bad and wrong. And then he goes on to say that democracy is formal equality, and that the abolition of classes is true equality. And this is kind of a great analysis. It's like what the liberal revolutions were. It was a formal equality. They wanted equality in the formal spaces, but equality in the formal spaces doesn't always translate to real equality. So if all is within the state, or if all is the state, not in the fascist sense, but in the proletarian sense, then capitalism can't take hold, because of the training and discipline of all workers to understand that they are the state. And it's kind of a reversal of the idea of everything in the state, nothing without, more as like the state within everyone and nothing without the power of the state. Gotta go, see you. Thank you for your help, Sinistra. So all citizens essentially become employees and workers of an armed syndicate. Members of society learn to administrate the state. The more the members of society learn to administrate the state, the quicker the state disappears. And this is, I again dislike the imagery of the syndicate, but it's the point it's making is still valid. Like, as everyone learns to live as the state, the less they have to really imagine the state. And this kind of goes into the disappearance of the state. Now, chapter 6, Vulgarization of Marxism by Opportunists. So in it, he kind of says, like, the Second International didn't really pay attention to the question of the state, and this evasiveness from it kind of allowed there to be this distortion of Marxism, which led to opportunism. So Plekhanov's controversy with the anarchists. In Anarchism and Socialism, Plekhanov evades the relation of the state to the revolution. The pamphlet has two parts, one historical and literary with valuable stuff, the second as a straw man about anarchists as bandits and bandits. And he kind of goes into saying anarchists claimed Paris because they misunderstood Marx and Engels and didn't approximate replacing the state. Let me check on this. The anarchists, all right, so I'm going to read directly from it. The anarchists had tried to claim the Paris Commune as their own, so to say, as a collaboration of their doctrine. They completely misunderstood its lessons and Marx's analyses of these lessons. Anarchism has given nothing, even an approximation to the true answers, has given nothing even approximating true answers to the concrete political questions. Must the old state machine be smashed, and what should be put in its place? I mean,